Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Laura Kovacs, and I'm honored to introduce our guest this evening. Moral, political, and social questions pervade Barbara Kingsolver's 15 works of fiction and nonfiction, including the Poisonwood Bible, the Bean Trees, and the Lacuna. Her writing is rich with the best things taught by great literature, re-engaging readers with their own humanity to a place of compassion, understanding, and empathy. Her work has won a devoted worldwide readership and a raft of awards, including the James Beard Award, the Orange Prize for Fiction, and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. In 2000, she received the National Humanities Medal, our nation's highest honor for service through the arts. Her belief in the power of literature to bring about change led her to establish the Bellwether Prize for socially engaged fiction. Advocacy for the natural world is a recurring theme. She last visited the Free Library in 2012 for her prescient novel Flight Behavior, which addressed crucial questions facing the world today. Why can we not talk about climate change? How can we look at the evidence and not all come away knowing the same thing? Tonight, she brings to us her 8th novel, Unsheltered, about crumbling structures, literal and societal. Though ripe with discouraging parallels to the late 19th century and now, it is ultimately a work of hope. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Barbara Kingsolver back to the Free Library.
Thank you very much. You're so kind. I didn't even do anything yet. Hello, Philadelphians. Hello to the people upstairs who are not in this room. Hi to you. Special hello. I actually love you the best. Yeah. No, I love you all equally. I am so happy to be in the city of brotherly love. I hope you're good for it. I need me some of that. I mean, not me personally, but the country, okay? So if you've got it, shed it like a virus. Send it like shed it on blankets and send them out to high places. I have enjoyed my one day in your city, my 1/2 a day in your city. That's book tour. You get to see every place briefly. But uncharacteristically, this almost never happens on a book tour. I had 2 free hours this afternoon, and I walked over to the Barnes Gallery. Are you all do you go there? You should. I understand that some people went to a huge amount of trouble to get it down here where you could get into it. So yeah, I saw the most famous mailman in Philadelphia. He's not even American. He's French. So yes, I have enjoyed your city, which I will leave in the morning. But another special thing to me about being here is that in my book tour, which will take me all over everywhere, this is the closest I will ever be to the setting of my new novel, Unsheltered. Some of it takes place actually in Philadelphia. There are a few moments of the book. There's a famous, it's not famous, it's just a scene. There's a scene in the novel that takes place on the Walt Whitman Bridge. The protagonist is stuck in traffic, having a fight with her father-in-law about whether or not they're going to listen to his conservative radio station, and she actually almost kills him. No spoilers, but most of the novel is set just a little bit farther to the east and south of here in New Jersey, mostly in Vineland, New Jersey. There are scenes that take place in the Pine Barrens. Who's been to the Pine Barrens? Yay! Good for you. You take advantage of your place. Good for you. Who's been to Vineland? Who's from Vineland? Okay. I was hoping there might be, how about you upstairs? Any Vinelanders? Yell, stomp on the floor. Okay. So we hear ya. If you had asked me 6 years ago, where will your next novel be set? If you'd given me multiple choice, a really long, like 50 choices, Illinois, Mars, I think New Jersey would have been on the bottom. I would not have guessed New Jersey. It's nothing against New Jersey. It's just I had no knowledge of it or any feeling for it. So now I do. A whole novel's worth of feelings for it. So what I thought I would do tonight is just tell you a little bit about how this novel came to be set in your vicinity, and I'm going to read you just the tiniest little piece of it because, you can read the book yourself. I don't need to read it to you. Or if you would like me to read it to you, you can buy the audiobook because I read my own audiobooks. I really like doing that. So I'm not going to be tedious or anything, but I hope you'll let me know, right? But I thought that you might be interested to know how a novel landed in your backyard. Well, it happened this way. After I finished my last novel, Flight Behavior, and looked around for a subject, it seemed to me that we were coming into something like the end of the world as we know it. And this was 5 years ago. Little did I know. Just so many things that we've all counted on, just so many truths that we hold to be self-evident. Rules of civility, rules of generous patriotism, the notion that our leaders represent all of us, or try to, rather than pitting half of us against the other half. Even really fundamental basics like that there will be a job at the end of the college degree, that there will be a pension at the end of the career, that there will be health care available when we are sick, even that the ice on the poles will stay frozen, that there will always be more fish in the sea. I'm sorry, it's really discouraging, isn't it? All of these things that we always thought were true aren't true anymore, or seem not to be true. Seemed like a good subject for an exciting, happy novel. As I do, I'm the disaster gal. I wanted to write about how people behave when we feel like we're losing what we've always had. That seemed germane to the day at hand. To examine human behavior, how we behave when we feel like there's not enough to go around. Do we become more generous or do we become grabby? Do we look to leaders who will compromise or do we line up behind the biggest bully? What do we do and why? It's really hard to look, and furthermore, kind of, if we can't, how do we get through the end of what we know when the rules aren't working anymore. How do we find new ones? Do we find new ones? This all is, this seemed like more than enough to keep me busy for a few years. And I thought, it's impossible to understand a crisis when you're standing in the middle of it. So wouldn't it be interesting if I looked back in history, because everything old is new again, looked back at some earlier time when people felt that they were living through the end of the world as they knew it, and look at what they did, what they actually did, to see if there were parallels to now. And so I decided to structure my novel in this way, that I would have two sets of characters, one living now in very contemporary times, in this moment of crisis, and another set of characters set in an earlier century, and I would put them in the same place, in a house that was falling down, because, of course, it has to be a falling down house. So the 1870s struck me as my moment of crisis that would be interesting, because here we were in the United States of America, just about exactly as polarized as we are now, truly. We had just been through a civil war. We literally, ruptured into two nations with two different constitutions. That war ended by an agreement on paper, but it didn't necessarily change people's hearts, nor did it change a lot of the things that had broken the country in the first place. There were, beyond the slavery question, there were profound differences of culture and of economies. It was a rural versus urban divide. It was an agrarian versus industrial divide, very much as it is now, along almost exactly the same geographic lines. That seemed interesting to me, to look at that moment just after the Civil War, when people are feeling, and also that was a huge number of people died in that war, or lost everything. There was no family untouched by that war. So people were bereaved, they were broken in trust and hope, and they felt profoundly insecure. All their familiar shelter had failed them. And into that waltzes, well, he didn't exactly waltz, he wrote a book, Charles Darwin. Launched these two books in the 1860s that announced to the world his view that after carefully considering the question for 33 years, it was time to present the evidence that the rules of nature apply to us, that we are ruled by the same laws that govern all living things, rather than the reverse, which is what people thought, that we make the laws, that we rule nature, that we rule life on earth because, that's what we were put here to do. He suggested that no, in fact, the laws of gravity, of physics, of chemistry, of natural selection, all these things actually apply to us, that we're animals too, that we came to be out of these same forces. It's hard to explain. It's hard for us now to fathom how disorienting this was for people. It blew their minds, not in a good way. Poor Darwin. He just thought, this once I make this careful argument, you'll see, you'll get this. It's just his good fortune there was no internet. He became the most hated person on earth People were so angry. Emily Dickinson wrote him hate mail. That's how bad it was. Poor guy. So I thought, this is my moment. This has got to be, an earlier moment when people just feel completely disoriented in the universe, and they're looking for shelter, they're looking for leadership. Most of all, they're trying to hang on to a world that is slipping away from them. So this was a novel looking for a setting. I knew the time period, and I knew I was going to need some characters. I'm instructed to stay in the circle of light. That sounds very spiritual, doesn't it? I like to wander around, so but I know you want to see me. I'm not. You don't really need to. Okay, we're beyond that. Okay, so I needed to create a set of 19th century characters who would somehow be invested in the Darwinian debate. And I wanted to do, because this just seemed that it would give authenticity to my novel, if I included some real people, some historic characters who actually had a dog in that fight. And I actually considered making Darwin a character, but it needed to be set in the United States. That's what I do. I write American novels. So I thought about Asa Gray, who was a great champion of Darwin on this side of the Atlantic. One of the few, actually. There were very few scientists who really stood up for this new way of looking at the world. So I was trying to make Asa Gray fit. It was like one of those dates that just, it looks good on paper. It was a very long date. I worked for several months on trying to set the novel in Boston around Asa Gray and his colleagues, and it wasn't working. And while I was reading about these men of science, I ran across the name Mary Treat as someone who was corresponding with Darwin, who was actually doing experiments and reporting to him, working with him in the way that, the slow way that people did back when they sent mail. And I thought, Mary Treat? I never had heard of her. I went looking for more information about her and found very little. No one's ever written a biography of her. I could only find out when and where she lived, which was most of her active years as a scientist she spent in Vineland, New Jersey. And so I thought, well, she left a body of work. She wrote many books. She wrote scientific papers. She worked as a botanist and entomologist. She corresponded really with all of the important men of science in her day. She was self-taught, of course, because women weren't allowed to go to college in those days. They had to go to finishing school, where they learned how to curtsy. You can probably tell I probably didn't execute that curtsy correctly. So I was so interested in her. So she wrote scientific articles and books, and she also wrote for the popular press. She wrote articles about natural history and science and the pine barrens and the birds and the spiders in her backyard for magazines like The Atlantic Monthly and Harper's. So, and some of her books were absolutely for a lay audience, not for scientists. So I was fascinated by her writing, but I thought I need to know more about her as a person. So I made a guess. I found out that that Vineland had a historical society. So I called there, and this wonderful curator, a person who worked there, named Patricia Martinelli, said, why, yes, we do have all Mary Treat's papers, because she died without heirs, so everything was donated there. So she said, come have a look. I got on a plane. Let me tell you, I fell down the Vineland rabbit hole. This woman was amazing. She had a personal life that was just like, just for starters, this crazy husband, I mean, literally, really, truly crazy, who ran off chasing a glamorous suffragette who believed in free love. He chased her to New York. Mary had a lot of friends and did interesting things in the town. And the town itself was remarkable. It had been founded in the early 1860s as a utopian community by Charles Landis. He bought this stretch of wilderness. He laid out a grid he brought in the railroad. He had a plan for this place, and he had he was a forward thinker in some ways. He believed, for example, in integrating schools 100 years before, the rest of the country did that. He believed in education. He also had a quaintly Victorian notion of utopia in which the working class, he attracted, he put out the word to get immigrants to come and do the farming and the labor. He got Italians and Greeks and people like that to come in and be the working class of the town and create, do the production, to be the farmers who made the food, who built the roads. And then there would be the upper class, the wealthy people who would attend the lecture series that he would create. And so that was the best anyone could imagine in that time in terms of utopia, which interested me a great deal. I thought this is really perfect, a perfect setting for my novel, sort of what people imagine is the best deal they can make, and then see what happens when that falls apart. This guy, Charles Landis, just got more and more interesting as I read about him. He was, you could say, a controlling person. He was the mayor. He owned everything. He owned the newspaper. He started the newspaper and he wrote everything in it, and he was the editor, and he published it, and he owned all kinds of businesses, and he was the postmaster, and he ruled the town and made the rule. He probably didn't pay any taxes. He made the rules so that they would enrich, they would sort of like all of his different businesses would profit from his legislation and his administration. And he had this funny hair, and when I got to the part where he actually did shoot someone on Main Street, I thought, I cannot pass this up. This is good. So that's how this book came to your community, came to be. So I'm going to read you just a little tiny bit of it, and then what I want to do is just open the floor and talk with you about whatever you would like to talk about. So the novel proceeds in two different centuries in alternating chapters. So you begin with the modern characters, and then in chapter 2, you're in 1870. And I used mostly real people in the 19th century, except for a family that, I had to invent the people who would really sort of do all the things that I needed them to do to live out my plot. So I created a character named Thatcher Greenwood, who has come to Vineland to teach in the new high school. Vineland had one of the first, at the time of Vineland's establishment of its high school, there were only 12 high schools in the country. So this was a very big deal. Thatcher Greenwood had come from difficult circumstances. He was very poor. unhappy childhood, but he kind of ran away during the war. He got educated in Boston. He married this hot babe, this 20-year-old beauty who turns out to be a handful. She's very acquisitional, and she really wants Thatcher to make a lot of money. And she has this mother, so he lives with his wife, Rose, her mother, Aurelia, who is a corseted bulwark of a woman, who has her own opinions about things. And then there's Rose's little sister, Polly, who's 12, and she's a pistol. And so Thatcher is trying to hold this family together. He's the new science teacher, and he's met with his principal for the first time, and he's very excited to teach the new ideas of Charles Darwin, and he finds out that is not on. These are transcendentalists in this town. These are philosophical people, and they are God-loving and God-fearing people. And not only is Darwin not out of the curriculum, the principal doesn't even want Thatcher to take his students outside to observe nature. The scientific method is very threatening in this time, in this era, for the obvious reason that it leads, it'll lead you to Darwin's kind of thinking if you're not careful. He didn't even want. So he forbade field trips. No talk of Darwin. He really ideally, the principal said really the ideal program for the science students would be that they should stay in and memorize poetry about nature. That's kind of where we are. So Thatcher lives, imagine this, next door to Mary Treat. So she's an ally, when they first meet, because Thatcher's gone over there because the dogs ran away, as whatever brings you into your neighbor's house, and they begin a conversation, and they quickly discover that they have a passion in common. They both really are very moved by the thinking of Charles Darwin, and he has confided in Mary that he's very troubled because it doesn't seem like he's going to be able to teach what he wanted to teach, what he came here to teach, and they share a love of nature and a curiosity about the natural world. So they're having this conversation. Where he's just said, my disagreement with the principal is really a problem. You and I are not like other people, he's saying to Mary. We perceive infinite nature as a fascination, not a threat to our sovereignty. But if that sense of unity in all life is not already lodged in a person's psyche, I'm not certain it can ever be taught. You are a teacher of natural sciences, are you not? Mary asks. I am. Also an employee and head of a family. As it happens, a family in dire need of costly home repair. I have inherited a flawed house, and I find myself pledged to uphold it. If I should lose my home and vocation, he found it difficult to go on. Since that awful moment with Rose, the day he told her, he had resisted believing a truth he now saw plainly. Mrs. Treat waited for him to say it. If I lose my position here and fail to find means for preserving our home, I'm sorry to say my wife would probably follow. I would lose her also. I can see no happy end for myself in noble crusades. Mrs. Treat looked him directly in the eye. Mr. Greenwood, those are qualities personal to you. They have no bearing on truth. Such words. And yet she'd spoken them without a hint of chastisement, only as one scientist to another. Whatever else he might be, she expected him to be rational. Of course, he said, you observe the situation correctly. Now she leaned toward him, guileless as a girl in her confidence. We are given to live in a remarkable time. When the nuisance of old mythologies falls away from us, we may see with new eyes. Falls away, he said, or is torn. The old mythologies are a comfort to many. But we are creatures like any other. Mr. Darwin's truth is inarguable. And because it is true, we will argue against it, as creatures do. Our eyes are not new, nor are our teeth and claws. I'm afraid I foresee a great burrowing back toward our old supremacies, Mrs. Treat. No creature is easily coerced to live without its shelter. Without shelter, she said, we stand in daylight. Without shelter, he said, we feel ourselves likely to die. I promise you, this book will not leave you in despair. That's what I promise, me being me. But it does tangle with a lot of difficult things. So I would like now to ask you for your questions. And before we do, I will tell you, this was on a previous book tour, the moderator opened the floor to questions with the wisest instruction I have just about ever heard, which was to say, before you ask your question, ask yourself, what is a question?
My favorite of all your books is the Lacuna, and I actually brought it and hope you'll sign it.
Thank you.
But it strikes me that so many of your books had an environmental take, and perhaps the Lacuna was a slight exception. And I wonder how you got to that and how you then got back to doing flight behavior in this one.
Well, are you asking why most of my books do somehow engage with the natural, like sort of ask the question of people, how people fit with the natural world? Or are you asking why the Lacuna didn't, or which?
You may answer the question you want, but I was more, but I was sort
And
of
I
more,
will.
but I was sort of more interested in the second, the why.
Okay.
Why is the Lacuna, in my opinion, different than
Different. Well, first of all, I went to school to become a scientist. I did not. I studied writing pretty much every minute of my life, starting when I learned to read, because I've always loved reading and I've loved stories, and I've always loved writing them, but I didn't think that's something I would be allowed to do as an adult human. I thought I would need to learn something practical, so when I was lucky to get to go to college. Very, very few people did where I lived. So I thought I should study biology. I loved biology, and I also was kind of raised by wolves. I just kind of lived. I had a completely unsupervised childhood and played in the woods and I just loved all kinds of species that weren't people. Nothing against people, but there are many, many others out there that I also greatly enjoyed, and who also were not unkind to me. So I went to school to become a biologist. I studied biology in college, and I also went to graduate school and got a degree in ecology and evolutionary biology. And I just kept writing, and before you know it, that just sort of busted out, I guess. So I did end up, contrary to my plans, I did end up as a novelist. So I see the world with a biologist's eyes. And so it's inevitable that, that will filter into my work. The great themes in literature, as we all learned from Miss Harney, our 8th grade English teacher, are, well, I'm going to update her language. She said man against himself, and man against nature, right? Those are all the books have one or more of those themes. So I never really liked all the against stuff anyway. But I mean, I understand there has to be conflict, but or it's boring. But if you look at it as a journey, I would update Ms. Harney's language to say that the great themes are the person struggling to find agreement with or peace with oneself or with one's community in social relationships or with one's environment. The best books, in my opinion, engage at all 3 levels. I really, really love books like, I love writers like Melville and Steinbeck, and Hardy, who really ask all 3 of those questions in one novel. So that's what I wanted to write when life gave me the option of being a novelist. But I begin with a question, and some questions are more specifically man against nature, if you will, and some are more the person and the self, or the person and the community. So the question I began with, and I am getting to your question, with the Lacuna, I could say, well, flight behavior was specifically, for example, going to be about how people talk about climate change. Prodigal Summer is the most biological novel that I've written of all, and that one I specifically set out to explain about 5 principles of ecology and evolutionary biology that I think everybody should know, and would like to know, but I wanted to just explain them in plain English instead of all the math that my professors used in graduate school. So there are some novels that begin with a more biological intent. The Lacuna did not. The Lacuna was a question, the question I began with was something like this. Given that this country started as a project of ongoing reconstruction, as a project of self-improvement, or the Constitution says, if this doesn't work, we'll rewrite it, right? It's the American Constitution established our country as a work in progress. That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry, it took me a moment. When did we get to this idea that a patriot sees our country as a finished product? How did that happen? So that if I criticize it, I get told to love it or leave it. If I criticize it, I get sent in the mail the suggestion that I should go live in Russia or something, because that happened to me after 9/11, because of some things that I wrote, thinking like Charles Darwin, everyone's going to see the reason I mean, really, it was what I was saying after 9/11. I wrote a series of op-ed pieces in which I suggested that this is a time when we could become a better nation than our enemies. That this was that answering fundamentalism with more of the same was not what Americans. That was not the best way to behave as a country. Well, I was wrong about that, evidently. I mean, people, it was actually terrible. I mean, I'm making light of it, but it was a terrible time. We got death threats. I had to have security. People, I mean, there were comical moments. People sent my books back to me as if, they all came from my house. I don't want this anymore. I'm sending it back. So that got me to thinking, I should write a novel about this. I just thought a whole lot about when did that happen? When did it come to pass that we're a finished product and any kind of self-criticism is so dire, so angrily received. So that was that's the origin story of the Lacuna. Sorry.
Thanks for writing this new book. You said if I can paraphrase you, that we wouldn't be disappointed because your book does not end in despair. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but does that reflect your own sense of where our own story, each of us, that we won't be in despair?
I think you're asking, are we all doomed?
Yes.
And the answer is that depends. I mean, as a biologist, I can tell you that our elements will be recycled infinitely. And I rather like the idea of my minerals, being reconstituted as a maple tree. But I know that that's probably a bit more of a transcendental answer than you're looking for. I'll just tell you point blank, I'm an optimistic person because I don't feel like I get a choice. I have children. I care about them. And I care about yours, too. I care about all of the people coming up in this world who are younger than me and who are going to be on this earth longer than I am. And if I say too late, it's too late, I can't fix anything, I'm giving up on them. Then it becomes so easy to say, carbon footprint, I'll just do whatever I want. Only by remaining hopeful do we remain engaged. I feel that to do otherwise is a kind of institutionalized child abuse. So that doesn't mean it's easy to remain hopeful. Hope it's not an intrinsic characteristic like blue eyes. It's a choice, and it's a choice that you have to make day after day because, my God, I mean, you run out of it by the end of the day, much sooner if you're watching, if you're reading the news. So for me, hope is something that I get up in the morning and put on with my shoes, and so when I write stories for other people, part of what I want to give you is are some of the tools that might help you make a similar choice.
Hi, and thank you for coming to Philadelphia. We're so happy to have you here. It's such a treat.
You're welcome.
I wanted to ask you, in the Poisonwood Bible, my favorite moment is when one of the characters realizes that God doesn't just root for the little boy dolls and the little girl dolls. And you go into talking about bacteria and all sorts of different organisms. And I think that a lot of the way in which you write about revelatory moments. So I'd like to ask you what your greatest revelatory moment was, and what in the course of your life, at what point was a moment where you took in another point of view and changed your mind?
Wow. In my whole life? Well, there are many. I think certainly one turning revelatory moment of my life was giving birth to a child and then doing it again some years later. Because for so many reasons. One is I thought, in short order, I figured out this is what everybody's been doing with all their time. This is why people leave the grocery cart in the middle of the parking lot at the grocery store. It's not because they're lazy. It's because someone in the car is about to die, or at least it sounds like it, and you just gotta get over there quick. For example, becoming a mother profoundly changed my life in terms of both understanding sort of joining that club of all the other people on the planet who had done that before me, but it also connected me in this concrete way with the future. I had been a hopeful person, I thought. I had been a person who cared about others and the future and the fate of the planet, I thought. But that was like bolted in. Now I'm bolted to the future. I love these people more than I love myself. So that was one. There have been many. One of the things that changed my life a lot early on was that I had a very unconventional childhood, as I mentioned. The raised by wolves part. My father was both. I mostly lived in Kentucky, in a very rural, very really a poor part of Kentucky, of the country. My parents both came from that area. My dad was a first-generation college student who just figured out that he wanted to be a doctor, and he managed to get himself to medical school, much like Mary Treat. He was that kind of person who was just going to do this, to learn this, and he was a very a service-oriented person, you could say. He felt so lucky to be a doctor that then he wanted to take care of people who needed doctoring really badly. So he joined forces with something that was kind of it was a precursor, I guess you could say, to Doctors Without Borders. In our case, it was a doctor with kids and a really scared wife, because we went to some really difficult places, principally the Congo. We lived, when I was 7, basically it's what I did instead of second grade. We lived in the Congo in a village that had no electricity, no plumbing, no cars could get there. There were no roads. There was anything like a store. Most of the people there had never seen, I think they had never had a doctor in this village. And my dad served a very large region, both as, like doing surgery and also doing public health. There was smallpox there. Like I said, very scared wife. There were cobras. People there had not seen. What was revelatory for me was that people there had not seen white. Most people had never seen white children. They may have seen white adults before, occasionally, but they had not seen white children. So my brother and I were just about the weirdest thing that people had seen. And kids would run up and like rub our skin to see if the stuff would come off, and their mothers would politely ask why we had no proper skin. And I had never thought in my whole long, 7 years prior to that, I'd never thought about being white. I'd never thought of whiteness one way or the other, and now I thought of it every minute of every day. So I worked hard to make friends with the kids in this village. They all were better at everything than me. They could climb trees fast. They were, they could catch snakes better. They could, much better. And so I worked really hard to win their approval, and I felt like such an outsider in this place. And when I came back home, I was still an outsider in a new way. My school had been integrated while I was gone. So now the kids who had previously gone to school in the CME church up the hill, it was like a one-room school that had about 20 black kids, and they all came into our school, which was a little school, rural school, but they were sort of sprinkled through our 12 grades, like, a few grains of pepper in each salt cellar. And I just gravitated right toward those kids because I thought, I know, I'm odd too. I get you. I never really completely could forget about whiteness again. So that's a revelatory moment. There have been others, but that's probably, is that enough? I think that living, also as I said, I felt so lucky to get to go to college, and I studied abroad. Living outside of this country has always brought me fresh ways of looking at my own country. And I said earlier, almost kind of casually, that I set my stories here. I write American novels, and that's not a rule. I mean, I could set a novel somewhere else, but I think that I have concluded belatedly that the things I write about fundamentally, the thing I write about fundamentally is a very American dialectic. I feel that, they say that writers are just writing the same novel again and again. We just try to trick you into thinking, with character in place, that it's different. If that is true for me, the thing that the thing that I'm writing about over and over again is this this push-pull between individual expression, sort of finding one's truth as an individual, and belonging to a community and finding one's truth as a member of a community. It's a dialectic. It's always there's always this tug between those two desires, which I think is a particularly American dilemma, because we are raised on this, on this box cereal of the solo hero, the solo flyer, the best athlete, the one who crosses the finish line first. We're meant to emulate kind of these Lone Ranger heroes, but in actual fact, their community is nobody is a lone hero. There's not just a woman behind the man. There's like women behind the women behind the women, and men behind the men, and so there's all this community going on that doesn't get much notice. But I grew up watching the women in the kitchen making the food and then bringing it out for the guy to say, "We thank one man for this," and I'm thinking, but no. So that was just because of the way I grew up. I think that's just in my DNA, that to sort that out. I forgot the question.
So my favorite book that you've written is definitely The Bean Trees.
Oh, that was the first one. I didn't even have any idea what I was doing. Thank you.
I found it really inspirational, especially since I read it right after an event happened in 2016. I know that there is a sequel to it, Pigs in Heaven, and that for most of your novels you don't write a sequel. If you don't mind me asking, could you elaborate on why you chose The Bean Trees to write a sequel for?
Yeah, that's an easy answer. It's not a sequel. I was thinking as I just explained, I was thinking about this sort of this conflict between the individual and the community, specifically as when I was living in Arizona, and I was noticing this thing that was sometimes happening where Native American kids were formally adopted out of their tribes. It's illegal. It can't be done legally, but sometimes it happens, just informally. And then there were several very notorious, I guess you would say, cases right in a row where these kids would be noticed at the age of something, 6 or 8, and the tribe would want them back. And there would be great hue and cry and headlines. And what I noticed is that the newspapers, the sort of white journalists were asking, how can it be in the best interest of the child to take her from the only family she's ever known? And the tribe was always asking again and again, how could it be in the best interest of the tribe to lose its children? And I identify, it was clear to me that these are two entirely different notions of what is the best thing, what is the most important thing. And I thought, I need to write about that. I would be very interested to write about that. And what do you know? I already set this up in The Bean Trees without even thinking about it. And I sort of felt an obligation then to use those same characters and carry them forward. So it was, I guess you could say, an accidental sequel, but I set out to write about something entirely new. And that's what I always do. And that's why I'll never write a sequel to any book that I've written, because I'm finished. I give those characters to you. You can do with them as you want, as you will, whatever. But to me, the exciting thing is to ask some completely new question, form some craft challenge for myself that seems completely impossible, and then try to do it. That's what gets me back to my desk every morning. The terror that I'm not going to pull this off. It makes me work so hard. I'm not a risk taker in so much in life. I buckle my seatbelt. I observe posted speed limits mostly, but in my writing life, I am Evel Knievel. I want to break the speed limit, the sound barrier. I want to do stuff nobody's ever done before. And that really excites me. So the idea of going back to something I've already done and kind of just carrying it forward just doesn't appeal to me. Okay, so now it is time for us to, I'm going to sign books later, but before you go, this is the altar call. I'm going to remind you that we have an election coming up. So I don't know anything about you or you, the people upstairs. I know even less. I can't see you. But except one thing. I know that you apparently are readers. You read books, because here we are in a library listening to a novelist. I assume that you're a person who cleaves to books. And that means that you're a person who understands the value of empathy, of imagining the life of the theoretical stranger and generating compassion for people who are different from yourself. We need us some of that. So I'm not going to tell you how to vote. I'm going to tell you that you're a person you're a person who needs to vote. So are you going to do this? Okay. Is anybody here? I mean, and of course, like if you're visiting, from another country, that's fine. I forgive you. If you're a citizen and you're not going to vote, please raise your hand. So that the people on either side of you can take custody of you for just only a couple of weeks. No, seriously, I'm not just asking you to vote. I'm asking you to do a hard thing. Think about the people in your family that might not be engaged in this process. Maybe younger people who've just turned 18, or maybe people that just don't feel like there's any point. And again, I'm not saying I know how you should vote. I just know that you should, and there are people in your family, there are people of your acquaintance who also should and could. I want you to help them. It's hard, I know. Do it anyway. Thank you so much.